Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. Once again, this is alexsachon, and today I have a very exciting episode for you. We are going to be picking back up with our series on mandalas and the philosophy of meditation as anciently practiced in esoteric philosophy. And in today's episode, we're going to be beginning to go a little bit deeper into this subject. In the first two sections, we talked about the philosophy of meditation, like the basic ideas and the basic psychological ideas that are involved. And then in the second episode, we went a little bit deeper and then looked at some of the specifics about how mandalas are used as part of a visualization exercise that itself is part of a larger meditation discipline. And so these visualization exercises are one of the components that was once practiced within the mystery schools in their higher esoteric teachings. And this aspect of the mystery schools is embodied in Buddhism in the inner esoteric aspect of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. And so all these topics about meditation and mandalas, we're going to be looking at in terms now specifically of a case study of Mahayana Buddhism. And so this is going to be a two-part case study, and this is the first part. So overall, this is part 3 in our series, but this is the first of a two-part mini section on, mini case study, I should say, on Mahayana Buddhism and how it treats meditation and mandala design and other factors involved in esoteric disciplines, esoteric meditation disciplines. We're going to be looking and revisiting the ideas and elements that we talked about in the first two articles, our first two parts of the series. We're going to be revisiting them today, in this sort of case study, or the beginning of a two-part case study on Mahayana Buddhism. And so in the part 4 that's going to be soon to follow, we're going to be doing a little bit more with the Mahayana tradition to investigate further elements of how they use meditation and mandalas. And we'll be looking at a specific example of 2 mandalas that exist in that Mahayana Buddhist tradition. And that'll be the subject of the next video. So this video is going to be looking at the fundamentals of how Mahayana Buddhism approaches meditation. And we're also going to be investigating of how Mahayana Buddhism uses its symbolism and mandala design to depict the afterlife state and the state of nirvana that one achieves at a certain point in their esoteric disciplines. So a certain level of meditation will bring you to a state of nirvana. And so in this episode, we're going to be talking about how Buddhism discusses the relationship between nirvana and this experience of the afterlife state, and how these come together in their symbolism and in their mandala designs. So the specific name for this part that we're going to be talking about today, part 3 of this overall series, is called Prayer, Faith, and the Afterlife State. But really, it's also the beginning of a 2-part mini-series on Mahayana Buddhism. So that's what we're going to be going over today. I hope you'll stay tuned. And we're going to pick up or start this section with a kind of an overview and a little bit of a recap of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. This tradition is one that we've spent a considerable amount of time on already in this overall book series that has been going on this year. And so the material from that earlier section will be helpful, but it's not essential because I'm going to be going over some of the main ideas again from a different angle and trying to make it a little bit simpler, and then carry on the key takeaways into this specific discussion about meditation and mandala design. So anyway, the first section that we're going to be going into is called What the West Can Learn from Mahayana Buddhism, and it's a bit of a synthesis and recap of some of that earlier material, and it's going to be comparing and contrasting sort of Western approaches to religion built around this idea of Orthodox Christianity and a lack of mysticism in the Western concept of religion, and how Mahayana Buddhism represents the sort of ideal of a religious philosophy that incorporates mysticism at its core. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in the first section here, and then we're going to be building off of that. So yeah, I hope you'll stay tuned, and I'll be getting right into that in a moment. All right, let's kick things off. What the West can learn from Mahayana Buddhism. And once again, all of the sections in this current presentation I'm giving are accompanied by pictures in the written article version. And that written article version is on my Substack. You can find that on my website, www.alexsachon.com, or go directly to the site itself, which is thewisdomtradition.substack.com. And the articles are there for free. And eventually I want to bundle these together and actually have a physical form of the book, a physical copy. But hopefully that'll come at some point next year. All right, so let's begin. There are numerous similarities and parallels in the stories of Buddhism and Christianity, along with some very marked differences. The original organization founded by Gautama Buddha, which was around 600 BC, emerged as an austere school of metaphysical asceticism, where a small community of highly developed monks bound themselves together in schools of study and self-imposed poverty. Devoting their days to the practice of disciplines of meditation and contemplation, this early sect of Buddhist philosophers formed themselves as a caste apart from normal public society. Like the early mystic Christian sect of the Gnostics, the way of life of this group held little popular appeal. Consequently, the social impact of these austere devotees was relatively limited during this early phase. In both cases, Christianity and Buddhism, the orientation and organization of the early philosophical school would evolve and progress over time, adding new features and dropping old ones. For example, Manly P. Hall summarizes the shifts that Buddhism underwent during the early period of the new millennium, and this is around circa 300 AD. Within the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, a marked change took place in the structure of Buddhist philosophy. There was a powerful motion toward the formation of a positive theology. The severity and austerity of the older Buddhist school was rapidly and skillfully modified. A new symbolism arose, which inevitably transformed Buddhism from a philosophy to a philosophic religion. Buddha had taught a salvation by merit alone, but within 2 centuries after the rise of Christianity, the doctrine of intercession was generally adopted. Hall notes that similar changes to the structure of Christianity took place at an early point in its history, ones that had the same effect of transforming the early ascetic school, such as that represented by the Gnostics, into something with more popular religious appeal. Given that, at around the same period, these 2 different philosophical schools, located in 2 different cultural regions, underwent a series of internal changes that closely parallel each other. It seems as if a common archetype was driving the evolution of both traditions. In terms of the symbolism they share in common, the most obvious is the fact that in both traditions, the founding fathers of the school, Jesus Christ and Gautama Buddha respectively, were historical sages whose life has become symbolized and mythologized into a great personified symbol of the doctrine that these teachers taught. So they come onto the scene, they have a message, and then in time, the followers of that message sort of mythologize the life of the teacher so that the life of the teacher itself becomes a symbolic embodiment of the ultimate doctrine of teachings that he had that survived. So that's why there is an allegorical meaning behind all of the myths of the life of Buddha or the life of Christ, because those myths are meant to tell you the story of the cosmic Christ or the cosmic Buddha. So picking back up again, just again comparing and contrasting, at this point really comparing the similarities between Buddhism and Christianity, Manly Hall points out that, quote, the principal symbols of Buddhism are held in common with Christianity. This is true also of their hierarchies, organizations, sacraments, monastic orders, austerities, and moral code. For example, both faiths have their bishops, abbots, monks, nuns, and novices. And in the Tibetan system, the Dalai Lama is the Pope King. Like the pontiff at Rome, he is regarded as the regent of divinity upon earth. He blesses, consecrates, and absolves. While both traditions were undergoing their internal changes and progressions, they each experienced similar patterns of division or polarization within their inner ranks. In the case of Christianity, this division came between the Orthodox Christian Church and various small groups of mystic Christians such as the Gnostics and Essenes, which were persecuted for centuries by the Church. In the case of Buddhism, this internal polarization was marked by its split into the northern and southern schools, the former or northern school called the Mahayana school, and the southern school called the Hinayana school, and those mean respectively the great vehicle and the small vehicle. The southern or Hinayana school, which is the small vehicle, took its root primarily in the east and southeast regions of Asia. This progressed in a direction that in many ways mimics the pattern of the Orthodox Catholic Church. Notably, it deifies the historical founder of the school, Gautama Buddha, much like how Orthodox Christianity deifies its hero god, Jesus Christ. Also in alignment with their peers in Orthodox Christianity, the Hinayana branch prioritizes the authority of the Church as the unique, divinely chosen bestower of spiritual salvation. Much like how the Church bestows its highest spiritual promises to its clergy, the Hinayana school reserves the benefits of the middle path for those who have taken the obligations of the brotherhood and dedicated themselves completely to the austere religious life. In contrast to the orthodoxies of the Southern school, the Northern or Mahayana school emerged to take a stronghold in the northern regions of Asia, most notably in China, Tibet, and Japan. Between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, an inner esoteric core of Buddhist sages and mystics, originally established in secret by Gautama Buddha at the time of Buddhism's original founding, shifted its center of operations from India to China. It is with this shift that the Mahayana sect was born. It was the ultimate purpose of this new school or branch of Buddhist philosophy to provide an institutional body or vehicle through which the esoteric teachings of the mystical sect of Buddhists, or of Buddhism, could be tethered to an outer institutional structure which, unlike the original school, could grow in reach and influence. Through this new vehicle, more and more people could be brought into the Mahayana system of teachings. And because this body of teachings extends from an outer exoteric level to an inner esoteric core, the system that these new converts would be brought into is one that is deliberately patterned to replicate the inner structure of the mystery schools. In this way, the Mahayana school transformed itself and the Buddhist doctrine as a whole so that it would emerge into a form that could replicate the old pattern of the ancient mysteries. The timing of this is important because beginning around 300 AD, the world age shifted from Aries to Pisces. With this transition, the pagan institutions of the previous era collapsed. This is something I discussed in the beginning chapters of this book. This collapse destroyed the old home of the mystery schools. So with the birth of Mahayana Buddhism, a quote-unquote great vehicle was prepared for this institution to move into and perpetuate itself during the forthcoming Piscean age. In the West, at the same time as the Mahayana sect was emerging, the small body of mystics associated with an early mystic interpretation of the Christian mystery, i.e. the Gnostics, Essenes, and Manichaeans, became ostracized and separated from the public institutions dominated by the Church. Unlike with Buddhism, the mystical core of Christianity was not given space to grow and mature its own autonomous cultural institutions. Instead of progressing in the same manner as their counterparts in Mahayana Buddhism, the early mystic sects of Christianity were relentlessly persecuted and extinguished by the Orthodox Catholic Church. The Church, unlike their Hinayana counterparts in the East, developed into a major imperial force in the world. Having become power-hungry, the Church actively sought to stamp out any competing Christian sects, especially the mystical ones, who in any way posed a threat to its hegemony over Europe. For this reason, Christianity did not develop a major mystical tradition in the same way that Buddhism did. Instead, the esoteric tradition in the West had to remain quote-unquote sub rosa. In other words, it had to go underground through secret societies, given that the persistent threat of persecution from orthodox religious and political interests was always prevalent. By contrast, in Mahayana Buddhism, the esoteric branch of the religion exists much closer to the surface of its public-facing institutions. Unlike what emerged in the West, the public-facing or exoteric institutions of Mahayana Buddhism provide the foundations and resources within which a thriving esoteric school can be supported. In Mahayana Buddhism, the mystical branch of the religion is explicitly located within the heart of its outer religious and cultural institutions. In Christianity, however, this is not the case. Its inner mystical core has had to survive outside of the formal body of the Church. Because of this explicit link between its exoteric and esoteric branches, a link that Christianity does not have, we can look to the symbolism in Mahayana Buddhism's outer public system of religious philosophy and find symbols and elements that in its inner esoteric schools are utilized explicitly in their meditation and visualization exercises. Unlike the tangled theological knot that the Christian scripture has gotten itself tangled into or tangled within over the centuries, Buddhist symbolism lends itself to be easily psychologized, as the hierarchy of deities and spiritual powers discussed in its scriptures are intentionally designed to be easily integrated into mandala designs, ones that students of its esoteric schools can meditate upon to great effect. Because the outer body of Buddhist symbolism is tightly keyed to the archetypal world of spiritual cause, both the advanced students of its esoteric school and the common devotee of its outer religious body both receive benefits from it, each at their own level. The archetypal elements and themes embedded within Buddhist symbolism have a constructive effect on all who encounter them, even when one is not meditating deeply upon them as a student of the esoteric school would. This means that the commoner may still derive psychological benefits from this system, primarily through how its archetypal symbolism and themes work subtly upon their unconscious. Meanwhile, this same symbolism is engaged by the devoted mystic on a more advanced psychological level. The Mahayana doctrine accommodates both, which is why it should be studied by thoughtful observers in the West as an invaluable resource of knowledge, inspiration, and wisdom. This need for a constructive dialogue between cultures is particularly relevant when it comes to our current discussion of esoteric philosophy's approach to the psychoanatomy of prayer and meditation. In the West, religion and science have for a long time been dominated by orthodox influences which have deliberately undermined the culture's connection to an esoteric and mystical doctrine. Consequently, religious ritual and prayer have, in the West, been severed from their traditional connection with mysticism. Consequently, they, like most other aspects of Western religious life, have fallen into an impotent and uninspiring phase where most people don't practice them or even believe in their value. And by that I mean the ritual and prayer. The mystical doctrine that we don't have but desperately need has been preserved in exemplary form by the Mahayana sect of Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism in its highest form represents an ideal model for how an exoteric religion can seamlessly contain within its organizational and doctrinal structure an inner esoteric body whose advanced meditational practices are built around the same set of symbols, beliefs, and values as those revered and worshipped by the outer laity or the outer worshippers or devotees. In this model, the inner and outer bodies of the institution are seamlessly connected, as are the higher and lower aspects of the philosophical doctrine. This is an ideal we must strive to reproduce today as we look toward the emergence of a global civilization. Ideally, the institutions that emerge to support a one-world government will be ones patterned after the best of what mankind has to offer, meaning that it'll reflect our best effort. So in this effort, Mahayana Buddhism is one of the world's great cultural traditions that we should look to today for guidance and inspiration, particularly as we seek to take on and overcome the various large-scale, world-shaping challenges and opportunities that collectively face us. And that is the end of my introduction section to this article. The next section is called The Role of Mysticism in Buddhist Philosophy. So I hope I set the stage now for the fact that it does have a mystical core. So let's go look at it, what that looks like. All right, the role of mysticism in Buddhist philosophy. In their respective evolutions, Christianity and Buddhism have both come to incorporate and emphasize a doctrine of salvation. Of the changes to Buddhism's outer doctrine that the Mahayana sect implemented, of particular note is its newfound emphasis on the necessity of salvation. Not only the personal salvation of one's soul, but the ultimate salvation of all creatures. This theme had not previously been emphasized in the earlier pagan religions, but now that the pagan order was collapsing all around, as it was during the early centuries of the Christian era, this new innovation, meaning the doctrine of salvation, emerged simultaneously in both the East and West through Buddhism and Christianity. But while Christianity and Mahayana Buddhism share in emphasizing spiritual salvation as the centerpiece of their systems of religious practice, each advocates a different method for attaining it. In the West, Christianity has come to emphasize a doctrine of vicarious atonement, which basically states that only through fealty to the church will one be granted salvation in the afterlife state. This earthly lifetime is meant to be one of penance, worship, and sacrifice, with the benefits of these virtues to be granted not in this life, but in the afterlife state which stretches into eternity. By contrast, Mahayana Buddhism takes the opposite approach in its teachings about spiritual salvation. It emphasizes the doctrine of reincarnation and its teaching that divine grace will be granted only to those who earn it. Earning this grace means living a code of life that is in harmony with the Dharma or philosophical teachings of the school. By comparison, Christianity does not require one to actually live the teachings of Jesus in order to be saved. One merely has to pledge allegiance to both Jesus and the church and confess one's sins, at which point vicarious atonement kicks in, and eternal salvation is magically granted to the individual. Going deeper into the differences between two traditions, in the Orthodox Christian approach, we find that no personal relationship or mystical experience of the divine is required or even desired. In Buddhism, once again, the opposite value is emphasized. In the Buddhist view, in order to experience a blessed afterlife state and quote-unquote be saved from experiencing a hellish purgatory, one must intentionally develop and release a relationship with the divine principle of self within. This relationship can be gradually developed by practicing Mahayana Buddhism's exoteric religious practices, but it can also be more rapidly stimulated by practicing the tradition's esoteric disciplines. In the esoteric approach, God becomes psychologized and is made available to be experienced in mystical states. No such concept exists in Christianity, with God seen as a power and force out there, governing earthly affairs aloofly from afar. A further difference between the two traditions is that, in the approach of Mahayana Buddhism, the church and priesthood is de-emphasized, especially in relation to its counterpart in the West. Rather than position themselves directly as the saviors of man, the priesthood of Mahayana Buddhism instead operates more like guides or mentors who seek to help facilitate an inner psychological process of death and rebirth to take place within their pupils. This inner journey is the true source of man's salvation. Mahayana Buddhism recognizes this and works constructively with this truth. Orthodox Christianity does not, and often works destructively against it. The core feature that Mahayana Buddhism holds over its Western counterpart is that it retains its connection with an esoteric philosophical center whose teachings and disciplines are premised upon its possession of a well-developed internal science of mysticism. The body of mystical knowledge that Mahayana Buddhism contains within its inner core is rooted in an original body of esoteric teachings that Gautama Buddha is said to have secretly given to select circles of advanced disciples and initiates during the period of his original ministry. This mystical foundation, retained by an inner esoteric core of the Sangha, which is their name for the Philosophical Academy, is the key feature that allows Mahayana Buddhism to liberate its followers from bondage to a power-hungry priesthood. In the Mahayana system, no intermediary agent is required for one to experience spiritual illumination. Ostensibly, anyone can study the doctrine on their own and reach the same ultimate realization that those who spend their life in a monastery seek to attain. In the Buddhist view, enlightened action motivated by self-discipline guarantees the ultimate attainment regardless of one's sect or creed. That's a Manly Hall quote. The most the priesthood can do is spread the teachings or dharma so that all who seek it can find it, and so that those who desire aid and direction in their journey can be provided it. In the Mahayana approach, man must ensure his own salvation, which he accomplishes by unlocking and releasing latent powers of consciousness and mind within himself. No one else can do this for him. Each person must do it for themselves. In the Buddhist view, quote, each living thing must bear the burden of the destiny it has marked for itself. It cannot escape the consequences of its own mistakes, nor can it require anything that it has not earned by its own conduct. Thus, only by overcoming one's mistakes and bringing one's imbalances into equilibrium does one qualify oneself for attaining a mystical experience of God, an experience that leaves one spiritually reborn. In the Buddhist view, this is again quoting Manly Hall, the end of religion is to transmute the confusion of living into invincible composure by a sequence of realizations of the immediate availability of total good. That's his name for God there, total good. Here, it is implied that the end of religion is a mystical experience of God, which takes place as an illuminating experience of transcendent self-realization. It is from this belief in the validity and reality of the mystical experience that their teachings on spiritual salvation are ultimately derived. In the view of Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha principle, or for Christianity, the Christ symbol, is understood as a transcendent divine being, the physical body of which is the terrestrial ecosystem of the earth. In the Buddhist view, this divine being, Buddha or Christ, is not to be worshipped, but rather meditated upon, contacted, and surrendered to. As Manly Hall explains, through a gentle kind of meditation, it becomes possible to release the indwelling Christ spirit from its mortal prison, in order that it may redeem one's thoughts and emotions and make them luminous with spiritual grace. As a result of this process of contacting the self within, quote, the individual finds that his own inner life is the house of the Holy Spirit. Consequently, religion takes on a new and vital meaning. It comes alive, becoming, quote, a moral beauty unfolding from within the person, causing all his works and thoughts to be beautiful. And some, in the view of Mahayana Buddhism, a view not shared by Orthodox Christianity, quote, meditation must lead to the personal experience of the Christ or Buddha mystery within the self. It is from this experience of the divine within that the soul's true understanding of its own immortality within Christ is granted. This realization is the source of man's salvation. Everything else before it is just a part of the path towards it. Whether we realize it or not, we are all on this path, and it promises to one day bring us all to the same ultimate realization, and this again is the Christ principle within. So that's the end of that section. Now the next section is called Buddhism's Revelation of the Spiritual Hierarchy. So now we're going to be going, kind of departing from discussion of Christianity, and we're going to be looking at what the Mahayana system can teach us about the nature of God. And it's interesting how it talks about God in terms of it manifests as a hierarchy of God-like beings. And these God-like beings are the hands and feet of the great Lord, so to speak. So they are they ensure the divine plan, and they work for it, work to bring all the aspects of life that are not yet awakened within the divine being, to bring all those lower orders gradually up into a universal state of enlightenment and illumination. That's the ultimate worldview that we're going to be working with. So the next section, again, is called Buddhism's Revelation of the Spiritual Hierarchy, and we'll be picking up with that in a moment. All right, let's begin. Next section, Buddhism's Revelation of the Spiritual Hierarchy. As we covered previously in our multi-part series on Mahayana Buddhism, in their system of spiritual cosmology, the aspect of God or Buddha that is made manifest within creation is called Vajrasattva, meaning the divine self. According to their system of thinking, this self releases or makes available its consciousness for creative activity through an interceding mechanism which Manly Hall often terms hierarchy. So let me just pause. These are all things that I discussed in detail in our previous chapter of Mahayana Buddhism. So just to, again, give you the basic idea, in their system of spiritual cosmology, God manifests itself through this initial layer of the divine self. So the divine self becomes the God made manifest. So there's an unmanifest God that's beyond the self, and then there's God as the self. And so this God that is as the self, the divine self, or what in Sanskrit is called the Vajrasattva, that becomes the creating power, the creating consciousness, because this self the universe becomes the body of experience that this self projects its consciousness into. So it becomes the one self over the many selves. That's this divine self. So one self over many selves. So the self, as it makes it available itself so that many selves can draw upon it, it does this by stepping its oneness down gradually into a diversity. And so this oneness steps itself down into diversity through the mechanism of a hierarchy of spiritual beings. So that's this Buddhist hierarchy. It's the mechanism of heaven by which heaven creates earth, essentially, and ensures earth's ultimate evolution. So picking back up, this hierarchy represents the universal mind in structure and function. It is comprised of a hierarchy of divine beings who together serve as intermediary agents or intercessors between the divine self and the various kingdoms of life comprising material creation. This hierarchy of intermediaries is based around three primary levels involving Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Arhats. Now, Arhats is the same thing as adept, but they're essentially equivalent concepts. So they're part of a spiritual hierarchy. Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Arhats. It's a threefold hierarchy. And so together they form the living psychological anatomy of the divine self. According to the teachings of this school's esoteric sect, in seeking to contact one's own inner principle of self, one will inevitably, along their journey, also come into contact with various members of this spiritual hierarchy. In the religious philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism, this spiritual hierarchy becomes available as a devotional resource to the aspiring mystic. Here, the mystic finds he lives in a divine commonwealth populated with a vast citizenry of enlightened beings. Together, these spiritual beings collectively exist as a heavenly city, sometimes called Shambhala in the Eastern tradition. It is to this heavenly city that the soul of man seeks to journey, either while living during the mystical experience or later while in the afterlife state. The sattva, or inner divine principle of self that exists at the root of each human psyche, resides permanently in this heavenly city. Here enthroned in this heaven world, lifetime after lifetime, it seeks the preparation of a soul vehicle that it may use to successfully bring to actualization inner powers and potentials that it innately possesses and seeks objective expression of. The doctrine of religious philosophy that Mahayana Buddhism teaches is designed to guide the soul toward not only the self, but toward a realization of this entire hierarchy. The heavenly city, with its royal assemblage of divine powers, agencies, and agents, becomes a source of mystery, inspiration, and idealism for the Buddhist disciple. It incorporates an ideal concept of heaven that one engages with not only during the afterlife state, but also while here on earth during the mystical experience, where its glory is made immediately available to the devotee. Therefore, in Buddhism, one does not merely pray to God to go to heaven. Instead, one strives to be disciplined, to do good works here on earth, and to live a philosophic life. In other words, one has to earn one's right to the mystical experience, with the payoff for this effort coming not only in terms of a more favorable afterlife state, but also potentially as an experience of mystical illumination and self-realization, which can take place right here on earth. In Mahayana Buddhism, the key to unlocking the mysteries of heaven here on earth comes with the challenge of learning to contact the divine forces, powers, and persons that reside in this heavenly city, which again represents the upper spiritual domain of the world soul, with this earth representing its lower material counterpart. This is the greater and the lesser that we talked about in our episode on the golden section and on how Plato described the meaning of the golden section. It was the greater and the lesser, and then an intermediary in between. So the spirit world, the solar world, you might say, and then the earth world, the material world, is this greater and lesser. And then there's the soul, which is the intermediary between the two. As the Mahayana doctrine emerged and began modifying the orientation of the original Buddhist system of teachings, a new emphasis was placed on the deification of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Arhats, meaning they all become incorporated into their concept of the spiritual hierarchy. Together, these came to represent the internal anatomy of the universal self, serving as the hierarchy of powers and agencies through which the divine plan is carried out and fulfilled. The keynote of this spiritual hierarchy is one of universal service. The various aspects of this divine hierarchy all unite in the shared effort of serving the divine self and his plan for creation. The hierarchy, in all its various levels, embodies the archetype of the divine plan. It exists as a perfect embodiment of the law. Together, these divine powers comprising the hierarchy constitute the archetypal world of intelligible ideas, as Plato termed them, from which this material world of individualized forms is extended like a thought form projected out of a divine mind. The Buddhist concept of heaven is intimately interwoven with the existence of this greater spiritual hierarchy and their heavenly city, of which the sattva principle within ourselves is a permanent resident. The sattva or self resides throughout all its various incarnations in this heavenly abode of the spirit. In the process of evolution, it gradually learns to gain control over the lower material elements of the psyche and body. As it does so, it converts this mind-body system into an instrument of its own purposes. At the point one gains full control of their lower mind-body system, one evolves to bodhisattvahood. By implication, one may only gain complete mastery over the soul's spiritual powers once they have renounced all worldly ambitions and vowed to labor solely for the greater glory of the divine plan. As Manly Hall explains, the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Arhats are fulfilling vows they made before the beginning of mortal history. Their vows always include labors of salvation, for the great ones can never rest until the tiniest molecule floating in a sunbeam has attained the true enlightenment. It is toward the fulfillment of this divine plan for universal enlightenment that the spiritual hierarchy of Buddhism is collectively dedicated. In this idealistic vision, all human beings are citizens of a great communal system of life. The highest ideal we can strive for is to become active, self-aware citizens of this divine commonwealth and offer ourselves and our lives toward the service and glory of this greater life. And that's the end of that section. Next section is called The Spiritual Hierarchy in Buddhist Symbolism. All right, let's pick back up. The Spiritual Hierarchy in Buddhist Symbolism. And the purpose of this is to go over and differentiate in detail how the three levels of this hierarchy of Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, and the Arhats, or the adepts, how they relate to each other and how the whole system fits together. Manly Hall explains that in its use of deific figures in its symbolism, Buddhism is not a worshipping of idols, rather it involves a series of psychological glyphs or pictures of ideas. In the philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism, the various qualities and attributes of the divine self and the universal mind are personalized as deities according to a strictly controlled pantheon of figures, with each figure in its framework of symbolism personifying an aspect of the universal mind present within varying levels of creation. In Buddhist symbolism, this hierarchy is partitioned into three primary tiers: the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, and the Arhats. Let's begin with the Buddhas. This is the first level. The highest level of the Buddhist spiritual hierarchy is occupied by the category of Buddhas. There are various levels of Buddha figures, each of whom personify a particular aspect and quality of universal consciousness working through universal mind. The design framework around which Buddhism's hierarchy of Buddhas is organized is based on the premise that a primary triad of Buddha principles, which we discussed in our earlier series as being Adi Buddha, Vajradhara, and Vajrasattva, representing basically the father, mother, child elements that we also discussed in previous episodes. And these again represent the threefold power of universal consciousness, or the threefold power of the spirit, which is consciousness, mind, and self. That this primary trinity manifests through a septenary of soul powers or Buddhas. So there's one Buddha, Adi Buddha, and then there's a septenary of secondary Buddhas. And in between the Adi Buddha and the secondary Buddhas is this Vajradhara and Vajrasattva, which is the divine mind and the divine self. So the divine self is the one that gives birth to these seven Buddhas. And the divine self is the third person of the father, mother, child trinity. Often given the more specific names, Dhyani Buddhas or celestial Buddhas, these seven soul powers form the spectrum of seven rays, quote unquote rays, emitted out of the mind of Vajrasattva, or the divine self, at the beginning of its creative cycle. So the seven Buddhas that emerge out of Vajrasattva, those together form his mind. So the mind of Vajrasattva is expressed as seven rays of consciousness. And those seven rays are the spectrum of seven lights that together form the mind, the mind or consciousness made manifest. So a good analogy for how this process works comes from the simple observation of optics. The divine self is like a pure white light, out from which a spectrum of seven primary colors can be distinguished and differentiated. These seven colors then combine and integrate in various patterns to form the rich, diverse tapestry of colors that comprise our world. It is important to remember that the concept of Buddha ultimately represents a divine principle or quality of the Creator's consciousness. There is only one ultimate Buddha, who is Adi Buddha. But within this Buddha is a hierarchy of lesser Buddhas, each existing as a lesser microcosm of the first. As we discussed in our previous series on Mahayana Buddhism, this first Buddha, or Adi Buddha, manifests these other Buddhas within himself by first stepping his own consciousness down into the condition of becoming a Vajrasattva or divine self. This is what I was just talking about. It is from this self that the first hierarchy of 7 dhyani Buddhas are emanated, or the 7 rays are emanated. In the Bible, these 7 Buddhas are referred to as the Elohim, and in ancient Hindu philosophy, they are called the 7 rishis. Together, they represent the 7 qualities of consciousness inherent to the divine self. Each serves as a vehicle through which a divine quality of consciousness can be made available for creative expression. These dhyani Buddhas, therefore, are identical with the hierarchy of creator gods that all ancient systems of mythology make reference to. And again, that's what the Elohim or the rishis are referencing, these creator gods. And again, these creator gods are associated with the principle of mind. All right, next section in the hierarchy, the second level is that of the Bodhisattva. As discussed above, the 7 dhyani Buddhas so they're also called the celestial Buddhas, and I sometimes reference them as celestial Buddhas or dhyani, which is a Sanskrit word that means meditating Buddhas, represent the 7 manifest qualities of the Vajrasattva or divine self. So the 7 Buddhas are the 7 manifest qualities of the divine self. One might think of them as together serving as the 7 mind principles or soul powers that the divine self emanates in order that the rest of its cycle of creative activity may proceed. So these 7 builders are the source of all further creation. Together, these 7 Buddhas exist as a spectrum of 7 lights or rays, which together make available the inherent qualities of consciousness possessed by the Vajrasattva. This divine self is the white light. They are the 7 colors of mind that emerge out of it. This is all stuff I just mentioned, but I'm setting it up for a reason. While the dhyani Buddhas represent supreme qualities of divine consciousness made available for creative expression, they themselves do not actively make creation. Rather, they merely make available the resources of divine consciousness so that creative activity can take place among orders of life that emerge to exist in a descending hierarchy below them, or below their level. This creative activity is actually enacted on a variety of scales by lower orders of creation. These lower orders are the ones doing the building. The resources that they use to do this building are ones derived from these 7 primary Buddhas. In between the Buddhas and the lower orders of life who are involved in building the universal form is the second category of the Buddhist hierarchy, the Bodhisattvas. The Bodhisattvas exist as an order of enlightened beings who serve as intermediaries and intercessors between the world of Buddhas, or pure consciousness above, and that of the lower forms of life enmeshed in material creation below. The Bodhisattvas are evolved human beings who have attained enlightenment during a previous cycle or age of the solar system's existence. It was during this previous cycle of existence that they initially attained illumination and self-realization, after which point they worked to evolve themselves toward becoming fully realized expressions of the archetypal design of their own being. So the sattva becomes complete, in other words. The sattva has evolved to a full expression of the archetype. So that's what a bodhisattva is a fully evolved sattva. So by attaining this accomplishment of becoming a bodhisattva, they evolve their souls or sattvas to the point where they become able to manifest in perfect form the particular quality of consciousness of one of the 7 dhyani Buddhas or primary Buddhas discussed above. In this way, the bodhisattva exists as a vehicle or vessel for the expression of a Buddha principle within creation. Since there are 7 primary Buddhas, there are also 7 primary bodhisattvas. Each is responsible for embodying and manifesting the dominant qualities of one of the 7 rays into the world of material creation below. Without them offering themselves to do it, the divine light could not be converted into a form that is usable for these lower forms of life. In their work, the bodhisattvas are performing an act of divine service. In short, a Buddha is a creative expression of a quality of universal consciousness, while a bodhisattva draws upon this divine quality or light and embodies its principles, bringing its spiritual radiance to the evolving souls of creation's lower realm. As Manly Hall explains, quote, the Buddhas sow the seeds of infinite wisdom in space, and the Bodhisattvas reap the harvest, bringing it to perfection by guarding and guiding the unfoldment of living creatures. Elsewhere, Hall describes these Bodhisattvas as the sons of wisdom and notes that through them, the unconditioned reality of the spiritual world is manifested in varying degrees within the conditioned universe of material form. Consequently, the primary state of existence for these beings is metaphysical rather than physical. They stand at the threshold of Buddhahood or universal consciousness, but have renounced it in order to offer their already evolved souls as a guiding light and spiritual resource for the evolving life forms below to draw upon in their own struggles to attain enlightenment. In astronomical terms, bodhisattvas exist within the solar sphere. This sphere represents the superior spiritual universe. There, seated upon their lotus thrones, they remain forever in contemplation, deep in the eternal state of the principle which they personify. This solar sphere, representing heaven, exists as the positive pole of the Earth's electromagnetic system, meaning it is the source of its light and energy. In relation to this positive spiritual pole, the physical body of the Earth functions as its negative material counterpart. Its purpose is to receive the energy and light of the solar sphere, i.e. the heaven world, and convert it into action and form within a matrix of time and space. So that's Earth's relationship to the sun, essentially the solar sphere, which is this heavenly, the greater world, the heavenly world, the world of the spirit. In the astronomical scheme of esoteric philosophy, the Earth is treated as a developing embryo, a future sun, who is growing and maturing within the body of a greater spiritual sun, this sun being not the visible sun in the sky, but rather an invisible sun, which resides at the circumference and not the center of the solar system. The Earth, along with the other planets, is connected to this sun via invisible umbilical cords, to and from which currents of etheric electromagnetic energy are exchanged. The Buddhas reside within the sphere of the sun and together represent the spectrum of 7 colors that comprise its light. The field of consciousness or aura of the Bodhisattva extends between the solar sphere or heaven and Earth and is responsible for bringing the spiritual life of the sun to the evolving orders of life existing in our terrestrial sphere. This terrestrial order of life that the waters of spirit are poured into is headed by the arhats or adepts, who together comprise the 3rd level of the Buddhist spiritual hierarchy. And that's what we're going to look at right now. So part 3 of the hierarchy, the 3rd level, is that of the arhat or adept. Arhats, or as they're more commonly called, adepts, are the 3rd and lowest member of the spiritual hierarchy of Mahayana Buddhism. This level is comprised of enlightened humans from the present cohort of human life on Earth, whose consciousness has been refined to the point where they become living embodiments of the Bodhisattva ideal. Adepts are humans of the present life wave who have elevated themselves to become objective realizations of the Bodhisattva archetype. But rather than exist within the sphere of the sun as the celestial Bodhisattvas do, this order of enlightened beings resides here on Earth, where they serve as intermediaries between the Bodhisattvas and Buddhas above and the lower human, animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms below. Thus, arhats are defined as highly evolved persons who have developed their souls to become clear channels for the transmission of light between the upper levels of hierarchy, the spiritual hierarchy, and the outer body of mankind still caught in the material matrix of the Earth sphere. The consciousness of these terrestrial bodhisattvas extends from the material dimension of the Earth into the lowest levels of the solar world, where it interacts with the consciousness of the greater celestial bodhisattvas who permanently inhabit this heavenly domain. These evolved brothers in Christ, quote unquote, live as terrestrial embodiments of the bodhisattva ideal. They serve to receive the light of God from the celestial bodhisattvas and bring it out into the outer life of man, which they do through their chosen institution, the mystery schools, i.e. the esoteric schools, the philosophic schools, or as they're collectively termed in Buddhism, the Sangha. An adept is therefore a Buddhist saint, teacher, and missionary of the doctrine, or Dharma, which represents the collective body of wisdom teachings that together reveal the divine plan. This notion of the Dharma represents the revealed teachings of divine law. These revealed teachings begin with the Buddhas, move down to the bodhisattvas, then to the adepts, and finally to the mystery schools, which the adepts are hierophants of. Through the mystery schools, the teachings then move out to the initiates and their disciples before eventually moving down into the lower grades of the school. This body of revealed teachings or wisdom teachings reveals the contours of divine law. This means that its doctrines of philosophical teachings reveals, for those with eyes to see, the archetypal evolutionary program for mankind's growth and development on earth. If learned and followed, this body of wisdom teachings, the Dharma, promises to shepherd mankind into the collective realization of a shared destiny, universal enlightenment. Gautama Buddha personifies the adept in Buddhism. Jesus Christ personifies this archetype in Christianity, and Pythagoras and Plato personify it in the Greek lineage of philosophy. In fact, the hero god of every ancient pagan religious myth also personifies this world hero. The life and message of these universal saviors lives on not only because of the outstanding example they set in their personal lives, but because of the legacy of teachings and the institutional body of the Sangha or philosophical school that they left behind. Through this body of teachings or the doctrine, which lives on through the life of the school or the Sangha, the legacy of the teacher, who is the adept, survives for all to follow and imitate. We are meant to become like Gautama Buddha and Jesus Christ, not to worship them, but to imitate them and bring out the same spiritual light that they brought out, and which made them great and worthy of veneration in the first place. It's like the old saying goes, Christ in you, the hope of glory. When we realize that the lives of these great teachers each embody the way of the bodhisattva, which is the way of the archetype, or at least the archetype of man, a way we are all intended to follow, then we can appreciate the significance with what we participate in when we begin to engage in the symbolism of ancient philosophy and religion. The lives of these great teachers, each personifying the archetypal life of an adept, represent the way that God intends all humans to live. We are all to be like adepts. And to be like an adept is to be, as Manly Hall puts it, a servant of the Veda, meaning of the doctrine or Dharma. And in so doing, one becomes the hands and feet of the great Lord. Through the lives they live, the body of teachings they leave, and the cultural institutions they found, the adepts of world history have risen to offer themselves as intermediaries between the higher levels of the spiritual hierarchy and the rest of mankind below. As Manly Hall explains, it is their duty to clothe the eternal truth in parables and fables, or to restate the doctrine on the levels of available understanding. But they must do so in a way that is initiatic and not paternalistic. As Manly Hall explains, quote, adepts are required by the law of the Manu to guide the race without interfering with the right of the human being to learn through experience. The adepts must keep the universal laws and are servants rather than masters of the great plan. And that's the end of that section. Now coming up, following that is going to be a section called The Symbolism of the Lotus. The initiatic approach of esoteric philosophy, whether practiced in Buddhism or another system, is grounded in the idea that the evolution of the soul must be self-driven, meaning it must come from within the individual who is evolving. The most that this hierarchy of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and adepts can do is to stimulate or catalyze this process of internal growth within the individual. They cannot demand self-growth of others, and they will not bestow it without it first having been earned. At root of the wisdom teachings that the great teachers of history have left us is the idea that life is an intentional process that moves from a starting point to an ending point. In between, things are meant to evolve from an initial state toward a final state. The teachings of philosophy are about learning how this evolutionary process works, how one's own life fits into this larger scheme, and how one can consciously co-participate in bringing this process of fulfillment to completion, first within oneself and eventually within the world as a whole. Here we come to the meaning of the symbolism of the lotus that we find throughout Buddhist artwork and its depiction of the members of its spiritual hierarchy. So in all the pictures of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and often the Arhats, you see them, at least in the heaven world, floating on lotuses. So here we come to the meaning of the symbolism of the lotus that we find throughout Buddhist artwork. Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are typically depicted as sitting on lotus blossoms. Here, the lotus represents evolution. These divine beings sit on lotuses because they themselves previously went through an evolutionary process to get to where they currently are. Furthermore, they are still evolving, moving ever toward higher levels of universal enlightenment. The deities of Buddhism have, quote, risen from ignorance and, like the lotus, grown up through the darkness of unreality to finally blossom in the light of perfect realization. This means they attain their wisdom by successfully facing and overcoming the same sorts of trials and tests we are now collectively facing and seeking to overcome. They have themselves experienced the burdens and sorrows of material life, which gives them an intimate compassion for the needs of a slowly evolving mankind. The divine hierarchy of Buddhism therefore takes on a special and highly personal form of symbolic significance. These godlike beings become like role models for us. They symbolize ideals that we are trying to discover and reproduce within our own lives. The Buddhist hierarchy personifies principles and qualities of life that are beautiful and sacred, and honoring them with special veneration, we begin to embody them in the experience of our own lives. Within each of us is the seed of an arhat and bodhisattva, one still trapped beneath the waters of material illusion, but rising steadily and, like the lotus, seeking its chance to blossom into the light of perfect realization. We are gradually evolving to become arhats, just as arhats are gradually evolving to become bodhisattvas, just as they are gradually evolving to one day become Buddhas. The process of evolution is universal and spiritual in essence, and it is only when we realize this that we truly become philosophers. And that's the end of that section. It's rather short. Next one is called the Western Paradise, Buddhism's vision of the afterlife state. Of the 7 celestial Buddhas or Dhyani Buddhas revered in the Buddhist spiritual hierarchy, one in particular is the subject of special veneration and adoration. This is Amitabha, or Amida Buddha. In the Mahayana teachings, Earth is regarded as currently being in the 5th of 7 overall world ages, which together constitute one great spiritual cycle of life on Earth. This Earth cycle is itself part of a greater cosmic pattern, also keyed to a pattern of 7. And the pattern repeats upward, finally until the one great cycle of universal life is reached. In each of Earth's ages, the light or ray of a different celestial Buddha is enthroned as a primary point of focus. In the 4th age, i.e. the Atlantean age, the previous age of man in the 7 cycle arc of Earth existence, that's what the Atlantean age represents. Atlantis represents the 4th age, so we're in the 5th. The particular ray of divine wisdom, i.e. the quality of cosmic consciousness that was released and made available for the consciousness of man to draw upon, was that of Amidas. I'm saying that because Amida represents the 4th ray, which is released. And so the idea of a 5th age is that there's a 5th ray that we are trying to release. And so the point I'm going to be making is that to release the 5th, we have to first, within the collective, release the 4th in its fullness, the fullness of its capacity. And that will open the gateway for the 5th. So the task of the 5th age, our age, the age that we've been calling the cycle of the Arya in our series, is to draw upon and bring into release, the full release, this ray of divine energy, meaning Amida's ray, which is now available for all of mankind to receive. In so doing, we make ourselves available to receive and develop within ourselves the light of a further ray, the 5th ray, that of the celestial Buddha, I'm going to say this wrong, Amoghasiddha. Now, all of this, again, was covered in the previous Mahayana section in detail. There's some charts that show what the list of all the different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are in this system of teaching. So please reference back to that series if you want to see that. In esoteric Buddhism, this 5th ray is the one that the prophesied forthcoming human Buddha or Manushi Buddha named Maitreya is intended to embody. And again, more on that in the previous series. And just to say, the conclusion of that discussion was to say that the human Buddha is intended to be the collective body of humanity, but more specifically, the sort of resurrection of philosophy as an institution becoming the embodiment of this, the life of this 5th Buddha. So we're not necessarily waiting for a single person, but rather an institution. And the sort of members of that school, just like in Buddhist thinking, the members of the Sangha, the philosophical school, become the embodiment of the teachings, and the teachings themselves are the embodiment of the way. And the way is meant to represent the quality of consciousness of the creator. So those who, essentially connecting the dots, those who are in this school and seeking to embody the way become the sort of living body of the universal principle that is at the foundation of the whole process. So the human expression of this Buddha and Bodhisattva principle comes through a human Buddha, but the human Buddha is a collective, not necessarily an individual. It's through individual humans collectively who will manifest the consciousness of the Maitreya Buddha. That's what that means. But it only has any meaning once you go into all the details of how the whole system works. So that's why I go into all the details, so that you can understand what the meaning of that prophecy is intended to say. It's intended to be a prophecy about a collective sort of social transformation and ideas being given light that weren't previously given light, such as that which occurred in the Renaissance was like a great example of that. And so the sort of prophecy of Buddhism and the forthcoming ideas that you find in esoteric philosophy about what's to come are ones that are associated with large-scale shifts in the collective and the way that the collective gives space for certain ideas to come out. And by giving these new ideas, new spaces, that more people will come in and embody those ideas. And so that's the idea of growing the Sangha, or growing the school. So this idea of resurrecting philosophy and then growing it as a school is a simple way of implying all these other things I'm talking about, up to and including this idea of Maitreya Buddha. And so this is the way that symbolism, you work with it and disambiguate what it's intended to mean. So let's continue. Before the fifth ray or fifth celestial Buddha can have its consciousness actualized by the collective body of man through this idea of the Maitreya Buddha, the light of the fourth ray must be first harnessed and released. And again, this is Amida's ray. So the consciousness of Amida or Amitabha must come first. Mahayana Buddhism's teachings regarding Amitabha or Amida, his kingdom of the Western paradise, which you might be familiar with under his other name called Sukhavati, and the set of philosophical disciplines associated with their heart doctrine, their famous teaching of the heart doctrine, are all based around this pressing need for mankind to develop and release within itself the quality of consciousness symbolized by the fourth ray, or Amitabha Buddha. In the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, Amida's quality of consciousness is currently enthroned in the spirit world of the solar sphere. So the sun has 7 spectrums of light, but enthroned in the sun at this period, or taking special precedence, is the ray that Amitabha personifies or symbolizes. In the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, Amida's quality of consciousness is currently enthroned in the spirit world, or the solar sphere. It is to this solar sphere, Amitabha's kingdom, that the sattva or spiritual soul goes to upon departure of the body during the afterlife state. Thus, Buddhism's teachings about reincarnation are associated with this heaven or solar sphere where Amida's ray of consciousness is enthroned. In the Buddhist teachings, it is also taught that each person's sattva or self-principle exists permanently in this solar sphere as a pupil, quote-unquote, of Amida's or Amitabha's. The ultimate purpose that each self must attain is to bring the consciousness of Amida and the other celestial Buddhas into a state of awakened realization within the person of a perfected human body and personality. This is the quest it pursues across hundreds of lifetimes. When it finally achieves it, the sattva becomes crowned as an adept, and later as a bodhisattva. While on this great quest towards enlightenment, in between lifetimes, the sattva's life energy retracts back from the lower psychic functions where it has been extended and returns to its host and source, the sattva or self. Because the sattva is a permanent citizen of Amida's kingdom, the consciousness of the lower bodily vehicle, as it is retracted back into the sattva, interacts with and responds to the quality and vibration of divine consciousness existing there, which is Amida's consciousness. So as the lower recedes back into the higher exists in this kingdom or plane of consciousness where Amida's quality of wisdom is enthroned. And so as the lower self retracts back into the higher, it has the potential to experience the supreme wisdom if the sattva has evolved itself to become open and receptive to it, which it does in various degrees, ideally, as it progresses. So those who elevate their consciousness into an experience of nirvana, a state that can be experienced either in the mystical experience or upon death, experience the divine life residing in this heavenly dimension as the Western paradise of Amitabha, also known as Sukhavati or the Pure Land. It is, as Manly Hall describes it, a heaven world of consciousness in which consciousness enjoys the jewels of its own blossoming. This experience is one in which the consciousness of the self awakens to its own true spiritual nature and in so doing becomes aware of, quote, the full psychic mechanism of the universal self, one that incorporates simultaneously all of heaven and all of earth. In short, Amita's consciousness illumines the wholeness of the psychic mechanism of the divine being. Being an inherent aspect of the inner mind of this divine being, the extent of Amita's dominion stretches over the entire realm of creation. It is our job to bring this kingdom into realization here on earth. Within Amita's kingdom, which again personifies a heavenly state or quality of consciousness, the higher self of each person resides as a pupil of a hierarchy of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who oversee and guide it. The ray or quality of consciousness that Amitabha personifies is ever present and ever available for one's sattva principle or self principle to tap into and bring into realization within its lower bodies. So the Amitabha again represents a spiritual resource that's available. It's a quality of consciousness that's available, and it's available for the sattva because the sattva exists permanently in this plane. The sattva is available as a transmitting agent. So depending on the sattva's level of development, it can transmit this energy of consciousness, supreme consciousness, which is what Amitabha represents. The sattva principle can harness this and send it into the lower bodily vehicle in order that it may bring the light of Amida and the other celestial Buddhas, because each Buddha has to have the same process of the sattva principle channeling it into the lower sphere of creation, into the lower body of the person. So it brings them into active manifestation within the lower material sphere of the earth, thereby transforming the world into an image of heaven. And the world, in this case, being the body or the world as a whole. Because one's higher self is intimately connected with the cycle of reincarnation, there is a close connection between the Western paradise of Amitabha and the afterlife state. Through the practice of esoteric disciplines of meditation, such as those practiced within the inner core of the Mahayana school, this heaven world is opened up to the consciousness of the initiate as an experience of nirvana. However, in the exoteric teachings of the sect, or the outer public teachings, the teachings about Amitabha and the heaven world he presides over are also emphasized because it is believed that allegiance to Amitabha and his specific doctrine of wisdom teachings, or the heart doctrine, are necessary and valuable for preparing the average individual for a blessed afterlife experience and a more fortunate future reincarnation opportunity. As we will explore below, there are very sound philosophical reasons that support and justify this belief. So the idea is that esoterically you can utilize these ideas as part of a meditational discipline, but even at the level where you're not ready to do that, but you're in a preparation mode, the study of these same ideas on a more religious level, a more devotional level, while you're living your life and doing the things that you're doing, that these things still have benefit because they, in a sense, these ideas and the disciplines associated with them and the belief structure itself are designed to enliven good qualities within the soul and to be a sort of balancing mechanism against imbalances and intemperances and extremes within the soul, so that there's a practical value of these teachings. And this value, again, has to do with this idea of the middle path or the middle way. And we talked a lot about that in that previous episode on the golden section that we did. So this is the end of this current section. The next one is called Meditation as Preparation for the Afterlife State. And we're going to be picking things back up. All right, next section, Meditation as Preparation for the Afterlife State. Mahayana Buddhism's concept of the Western paradise is their version of a common archetype we find throughout the religious myths of world history. That behind this material world of life and death is basically a paradise world or a heavenly world comprised of spiritual beings. In the Mahayana system, we find this archetypal idea that a spiritual hierarchy of godlike beings serve as the spiritual guardians over mankind's destiny, integrated with a system of esoteric disciplines specially designed to awaken one's consciousness to the divine powers residing in the spirit world. The most personal and intimate of these powers one attempts to awaken oneself to is one's own sattva or self-principle, which permanently resides in this heaven world, where it extends lifetime after lifetime, evolving individual human personalities that it enlivens and ensouls with its own psychic powers and potentials. So the afterlife state and one's own higher self become intimately connected in Buddhist philosophy. Through the lineage of evolving human personalities it extends, the sattva expresses its own innate soul powers and brings them into various degrees of active expression. The sattva, existing behind and between the lifespans of all these various personalities, becomes the receptacle or container of the cumulative evolution experienced by all of them. Through the many personalities it extends, the sattva pursues its own evolution as it attempts to grow and develop toward becoming the perfect expression of an ideal already established for it by a greater divine power. This ideal, the ideal for the sattva, is that of the bodhisattva. It is to the sattva principle that each of us possesses within ourselves, the seed, spiritual seed. It is to this sattva principle that we meditate. It is to it that we dedicate our lives in service to. And it is also to it that we return again after death. And it is within it that we rest during the period between incarnations. At death, the consciousness of the individual ascends back to its spiritual seed or higher self, which sometimes calls the superego, which is the incarnating individuality whose existence extends over hundreds of terrestrial lifespans. As Manly Hall explains, in the period between incarnations, the entity does not go to a place, but rather passes through a process of internal motion toward the source of self. The consciousness of this self, or sattva principle, is enthroned in Amita's pure land, i.e. in the spirit world. This is the plane where one's consciousness retracts back into upon death of the body. So it's where the sattva resides, and therefore, upon death of the body, the consciousness recedes back into this spiritual state, and therefore experiences or has the opportunity to experience the consciousness enthroned in this state. According to the sattva's own degree of evolution, it will, during this afterlife state, be awakened to the divine quality of consciousness that Amita and the Western paradise represent. What is the nature or quality of the consciousness enthroned here? Manly Hall explains, as the Buddha of boundless light, Amitabha signifies the light of reality itself, which illumines, that is, makes knowable to the subjective powers of the human being, the very mystery of existence. This is not a physical, but a spiritual radiance by which the substance of things beyond form and dimension are made knowable to the open eye of the seer. So that's very mystical, but that's the type of sort of transcendent consciousness, the transcendent quality of consciousness that one finds in this kingdom, this Western paradise or pure land. It's an illuminating state of consciousness. So to be receptive to it, one has to prepare for that level of illumination. You can't just receive it no matter what. You have to prepare for it. This heaven dimension therefore symbolizes a quality of consciousness that is ever present and ever available for the sattva principle within each of us to awaken to and draw upon. But it first must awaken from its slumber, meaning its illusions and attachments to material life. Each person's sattva, depending upon its state of evolution, is responsive to Amita's wisdom ray within a spectrum of various degrees of receptivity. The more receptive a soul has evolved to become in relation to the quality of consciousness that Amita personifies, the more it will blossom into a profound experience of these blessed qualities during the afterlife state. Thus, in the Buddhist system, there is a close relationship between the relative state of evolution of one's sattva principle and the quality of experience that one will undergo in the afterlife state. The Buddhists describe their heaven world, the Western paradise, as a sphere of karmic compensation, provided as an experiential reward to humans who have purified their souls to the point that they become receptive to its harmonic patterns and qualities of vibration. As Manly Hall explains, Sukhavatis, or the Western paradise, is a blessed realm in which the transmuted subconscious of man exists. So transmuted just means like made aware to, made receptive of. It's archetypal. It is by his own merits or good karma that he creates the wondrous atmosphere of Amida's heaven. For this reason, we must understand that the elevated quality of consciousness that Sukhavati personifies is one that is built, quote, in the subtle substances of our own thoughts and emotions, meaning its reality plays out within our own psyches, with one's own merits and karma building this paradise within the boundaries of one's own consciousness. Souls develop receptivity to Amida's refined quality of consciousness by dedicating themselves to the task of channeling and releasing in their lifetimes as much of its graces and attributes as possible. The qualities that Amida embodies are simple and universal, those of love, compassion, faith, dedication, and service. These are ever present and ever available for humanity to awaken itself to and tap into. The task of each individual is to find these qualities within themselves and learn to become receptive to their influence. When they do, the Western paradise, or even the experience of nirvana, is granted, for it comes only, quote, to the regenerated soul brought back into harmony with the divine plan. Otherwise, if one has not learned to become receptive to the qualities of Amida's wisdom ray to some degree during embodiment, then in the afterlife state, their soul will remain asleep and unresponsive to it. Those who follow Amida's doctrine of teachings, the heart doctrine, and embody its virtues are rewarded in the form of having souls that are better able to attune themselves to the qualities of his consciousness during the afterlife state. As Manly Hall explains, the consciousness of Amida, quote, transcends the confused structure of the mental world and builds in the subtle substances of regenerated thought and emotion the splendid palace of the Western paradise. Exoterically, the benefit that the religious practitioner receives from following Amida's rites and studying the symbolism associated with them is that they subtly prepare their own soul to become more receptive to the ray of wisdom he embodies. The development of this receptivity has a definite payoff in the form of the quality of experience one obtains in the afterlife state. Esoterically, however, these same symbols and rites dedicated to Amida Buddha can simultaneously be approached on a deeper level as the subject of an advanced system of meditation in which the mystic or initiate attempts to connect with their higher self, residing in Amitabha's kingdom while still alive in the body. In the effort to catalyze the development of this power of spiritual receptivity within the soul, the sages behind the Mahayana school devised a practice of religious observances and mandala meditations designed to make the individual more available to Amida's wisdom ray. In esoteric philosophy, the act of attaining nirvana in meditation involves engaging with the same process of ego death as that which one experiences after the physical body dies, when the soul detaches from the body and the sattva principle retracts its energies back into itself for the duration of an afterlife cycle. In Mahayana Buddhism, ideas and symbols about the afterlife state are actively meditated upon so that one's consciousness begins to resonate in tune with their themes and principles. In this way, the Western paradise becomes the target of a prayer and meditation discipline, one that is geared exoterically toward the cultivation of a favorable afterlife state and esoterically toward the attainment of self-realization. To experience the state of nirvana that the Western paradise symbolizes in the afterlife state is desirable, but to experience it while still alive is better. And it is to this latter aim that the true intentions of the heart doctrine are directed. The practices of the heart doctrine can be understood to take place across two levels, one exoteric and one esoteric. Exoterically, the heart doctrine is involved with the need to purify and refine one's soul and to open up one's heart center. This process is something that one experiences tangible rewards for in the afterlife state in terms of the quality of consciousness that your sattva becomes able to become receptive to during the period between incarnations. Esoterically, these same symbols and teachings about the heart doctrine become the subject of an elaborate meditation discipline in which one meditates upon the features and qualities of the Western paradise, such that the psychic image one is building within one's mind taps into this very real archetype that exists within the collective unconscious. The esoteric method of meditation based around the heart doctrine is rather simple. To quote Manly Hall, one attempts the interior visualization of the nature and attributes of the Buddha Amitabha. Here, the aim is for the intellect to center itself upon the adoration of deity, brotherly love, and the recognition of human dependencies upon a divine power. A prerequisite for the more advanced and esoteric aspects of the heart doctrine is the need for the disciple to first cultivate the simple virtues of faith, compassion, service, and love within themselves. As Hall explains, the Mandala quote can be vitalized only by an individual who is utterly convinced that the Amida or Amitabha idea is the transcendent reality, or is the truth. Once the necessary preparations have been undertaken, one meditates upon the various symbolic elements of a Western paradise mandala. The aim is to bring this mandala into visualization within one's third eye while ensouling it with absolute faith and sincerity. During one's contemplation, quote, the mandala is gradually impressed upon the psyche, and this radiant and beautiful design, made alive by psychic energy, moves out of the subjective part of the personality and confronts the believer as a blessed vision. Psychologically, what is happening is that the Amitabha archetype within our own unconscious, one connected to the sattva principle that rules the entire psyche, itself connects to archetypal elements captured within the mandala. Through this process of mutual resonance, meaning is stimulated in the innermost aspect of one's psychic structure. The mandala, ensouled with the faith and dedication of the mystic, becomes the instrument through which a transmission of psychic energy takes place and an experience of illumination becomes catalyzed. Thus, quote, through a chemistry of faith and service, the power of God is released in the human psyche to work its wonders and renew the life of the flesh, end quote. That's Manly Hall. So that wraps up that section. 2 more to go. Next one is called the Bodhisattva's Vow and the Mood of Compassion. And again, all this is available in a written form. I hope you'll check that version out as well. So we'll be picking back up with this new section in a second. All right, in this next section, we're going to be looking at the Bodhisattva archetype and how it relates to this mood or quality of consciousness associated with compassion and mercy, and how these are aspects of divine love, which Amitabha embodies. So let's pick up in the beginning here, first sentence. As explored above, in Mahayana Buddhism's system of religious philosophy, it is believed that those who have lived a life in harmony with Amida's quality or ray of consciousness can experience at the moment of death a vision and experience of the Western paradise, i.e. the spirit realm. According to the Mahayana teachings, quote, at the time of death, as the sensory perceptions dim, the Amitabha triad, composed of Amida Buddha and his 2 constituent bodhisattvas, Kuan Yin and Manjusri, and again, see my previous episode from previous series on Mahayana Buddhism for more on those 2 bodhisattvas, although Kuan Yin we'll be talking about shortly in more detail. But for more on Manjusri, see my previous series. So anyway, the Amitabha triad is those 2 bodhisattvas and Amitabha. So at death, as the sensory perceptions dim, this triad seems to appear before the dedicated believer to lead his consciousness to the pure land. That's a Manly Hall quote. As a celestial Buddha, Amida represents a quality of divine consciousness. The particular ray of consciousness that Amida personifies is one that is associated with the mood of supreme spiritual love. This love is the quality of consciousness enthroned in Amida's kingdom. It is what the devoted soul experiences in the afterlife period. This divine experience of love is available for all souls to experience either during the mystical experience or the afterlife state. As Manly Hall describes it, Amida's love is, quote, simply put, a pure emotion that symbolizes the longing of parts to return to union with the whole. The spiritual world where Amida's divine love is enthroned is called Amitabha's kingdom or the Western paradise. According to the Mahayana teachings, Those who live by Amita's code of life will, after death, become receptive to at least some measure of Amita's consciousness, and therefore will be blessed with an experience of this divine love in the afterlife state. The power of divine love that Amitabha symbolizes is a universal one. The individual cannot experience it directly. Rather, for the human to experience it, it must be bestowed through a third intermediary source. Here's where the concept of the bodhisattva comes in. The bodhisattva is a special category of spiritual being who exists to serve as a vessel or intermediary through which the pure light of the celestial Buddhas can be brought down to a level that it can be comprehended and absorbed at the level of the developing human soul. As Amitabha Buddha's patron bodhisattva, Kuan Yin, who is also known as Avalokita, and in Japan, I think called Kannon, but I usually alternate between Kuan Yin and Avalokita. So this bodhisattva is the patron bodhisattva of Amitabha Buddha, meaning the patron vehicle to bring Amitabha's consciousness into the earthly sphere, the material world. So as Amitabha Buddha's patron bodhisattva, Kuan Yin embodies the archetypal emotions of compassion and mercy. These are innate qualities of Amitabha Buddha and the mood of divine love that he represents. Kuan Yin's purpose is to serve as a vehicle for the translation of the divine emotions and energies of Amitabha into the lower material sphere of the earth. Manly Hall teaches that compassion is the mood that permeates heaven and makes the existence of the Pure Land possible. Quote, compassion is the very plan by which all that exists is assured the fulfillment of its own divine destiny. It provides all beings with an infinite opportunity to unfold. Hall continues, quote, compassion is a giving of oneself to the service of all who need understanding, protection, sympathy, and generosity. It is also, quote, an acceptance with quiet understanding of the inevitable imperfections present within all human beings. Kuan Yin personifies this mood of compassion, serving as an ideal for how its virtues can be practiced and experienced at a level of supreme perfection. Manly Hall explains that the name Avalokita or Kuan Yin means, quote, the one who looks down, or he who hears the voice of the world. This name is a reference to the idea that this bodhisattva is, quote, specially mindful of the sorrows, burdens, and spiritual yearnings of human beings. While actually being an androgynous spiritual being, meaning that married the masculine and feminine aspects within themselves, they're married together. But so actually androgynous, Kuan Yin is often associated with motherly or maternal qualities and attributes. Quote, she abides in the Western paradise of Amitabha, where she inclines her consciousness in perpetual attentiveness to all creatures that have not achieved internal security. The mechanism or medium by which this bodhisattva is able to attune herself to the emotional suffering of humanity is through the field of her aura, which extends down from the solar or spiritual sphere to envelop the highest and most subtle planes of the planetary sphere. According to the teachings of the heart doctrine, prayers addressed to this enlightened spiritual soul, herself an extension of a greater spiritual consciousness, received special consideration, quote unquote, with the meaning prayers are actualized by this bodhisattva, with the all-encompassing aura of this great being serving as the mechanism through which this communication of prayer can be transmitted. In terms of the divine qualities she personifies, Kuan Yin embodies the mood of the mother for her young. In this way, she epitomizes a maternal archetype that is within each human soul. Symbolically, Kuan Yin personifies an inherent aspect of the sattva or spiritual soul of each person. This sattva principle, as the spiritual source of each person's soul, is the mother of bodies, with each incarnation of a personality being under its maternal oversight. So the spiritual soul is like a mother, and the particular aspect of the mother that this soul represents is embodied by Kuan Yin. By finding and connecting with the Kuan Yin archetype within themselves and becoming gradually receptive to its influence, the true believer prepares themselves for an experience of the soul mother. Manly Hall explains that, quote, Kuan Yin is experienced as what the Vedantists call the mystery of the soul mother. Here, quote, the meditating mystic perceives divine love as everywhere present and radiating throughout all created things. The activation of this internal archetype within ourselves involves a transcendent experience of emotion in which one feels not only compassion for this world, but also a sense of identity with all that lives. But only those who have attained perfect compassion can experience Avalokita or Kuan Yin in the fullness of her immeasurable benevolence. For Kuan Yin, there is only the eternal compassion which desires perfection for all creatures. Those who would experience the presence of this divinity must therefore know or first know the mystery of unselfish love within their own soul. Beyond being merely a representative or symbol of an archetype within ourselves, in the Mahayana system, Avalokita is also understood as a real spiritual being that one can pray to and call upon. She is an actual conscious being, a fully evolved human soul from a previous cycle of life, one who has pledged her existence to stimulating and bringing out Amitabha's archetype of divine love within the developing body of mankind. In Buddhist mysticism, Kuan Yin becomes an important aspect of the religious and meditational rites dedicated toward connecting oneself with the consciousness of the transcendent being Amitabha. The sattva or spiritual soul of each human encounters Amitabha and the Pure Land through the interceding presence of Avalokita. This interaction takes place as a profound and enlightening mystical experience, one in which the blessed Avalokita appears to guide you into the glorious afterlife state, where your sattva will await a future incarnation in a state of spiritual bliss or nirvana. In the thinking of the Mahayana school, this experience of Avalokita and the consciousness of the Western paradise can be had either exoterically at the moment of death or esoterically during the mystical experience. So that wraps up that section on the Bodhisattva's vow and the mood of compassion, and one final section remains, and that's called Meditation and the Science of Salvation. All right, in this final section, again called Meditation and the Science of Salvation, we're again going to be talking about Avalokita as a bodhisattva who embodies and represents the consciousness of Amitabha, who again is associated with the afterlife state and the quality of consciousness of the mystical experience of nirvana. Simultaneously, he's both of those. So meditation and the science of salvation, this final section, again picking back up with Kuan Yin or Avalokita. In the devotional and mystical practices of the Mahayana school, Avalokita is incorporated as an essential point of focus, one through which, quote, increasing awareness of the divine nature and the divine plan can be catalyzed within the devotee. As Manly Hall describes, quote, Avalokita became the focal point for a discipline of meditation. This divinity was visualized in its several forms and with its numerous attributes. Each of these in turn was examined by the internal resources of the meditating mystic. For example, quote, Kuan Yin is usually represented in graceful flowing garments that are highly stylized, but with extreme purity of line. The graceful design suggests to the receptive consciousness perfect harmonious motion. While ensouling one's visualization of her image with the mood of compassion, love, and mercy, the gracefulness of the motions suggested in mandalic images of her become catalysts for, quote, an inward experience of the inspiration to graceful and gracious conduct. Here, the feeling of ordered beauty unfolds moral and ethical implications. As the devotee continues to establish an identity within themselves with the quality of consciousness that Kuan Yin personifies, the archetypal qualities within their own soul that Kuan Yin does symbolize or personify begin to come out more and more. One's inner life then becomes ennobled by these visualizations and aligns further with the Kuan Yin archetype. This self-reinforcing process is also reflected in one's conduct as one, quote, attains merit through performing the works of Kuan Yin with the same state of consciousness that the deity personifies. In this way, through the intermingling of faith, sincerity, meditation, and service, a spiraling process of archetype alignment intensifies, one that culminates in a mystical experience of the Kuan Yin archetype. To begin this process of tapping into the archetypal soul power that Avalokita embodies and that we each possess, the mystic must first visualize, as an act of personal consciousness, the state of universal good to which they aspire, with special emphasis upon the service which they plan to perform for the salvation of mankind. This means that they must put themselves in the mood of a bodhisattva in this case using Kuan Yin as the archetypal bodhisattva that they are seeking to resonate with. By identifying with Kuan Yin, the sattva principle within the psyche recognizes an archetypal potential within itself that the symbol of the bodhisattva is capturing. It then begins to resonate with it. This resonance serves as a catalyst for the activation of this internal archetype within the self. Here, Hall explains that, quote, when the transitory or lower self beholds the imperishable higher self, which is what Kuan Yin symbolizes, at least in essence, represents a quality that exists within the higher self. It becomes, in this instant, aware of its own eternity and its true identity as a dedicated disciple of this overlord. This is the noble realization that leads to spiritual emancipation. And when this emancipation comes, it does so as a blessing bestowed, quote, from the heart of Kuan Yin. The power of divine love and compassion that Kuan Yin bestows possesses an innate power to redeem the karma of those who encounter its energetic resonance. As Manly Hall explains, negative karma can be transmuted by the power of love, making love a force of divine salvation in the world. Many Buddhists believe that the experience of identity with the compassionate bodhisattva Kuan Yin breaks the bonds of karma, or more correctly, replaces the old indebtedness with so luminous a conviction that the believers are freed from the wheel of rebirth. This does not mean that their sins have been forgiven, but rather that the intensity of enlightened consciousness has equaled the time dimension and overcome it. Again, Manly Hall. In other words, the energetic impact of encountering the numinous archetype of the Soul Mother shatters the false patterns that would otherwise bound one to the shackles of the wheel of karma. And this way, as Manly Hall explains, quote, man is not redeemed by a compassionate being who forgives sin, but by a universal principle of compassion which neutralizes or transmutes those propensities to excess which cause negative karma. Meaning that the energetic impact of it has a lasting effect on the soul. And in a sense, it can have the power of liberating at least some sort of false patterns that represent karma, coming karma, because karma is needed to work out those patterns. So the compassion of this bodhisattva can have an effect on that level. But as we'll see, to really work, it needs your participation. So we'll get to that. The great alchemical work that Avalokita catalyzes within us is the transmutation of willpower until it becomes the will to peace. As this shift happens, the human soul releases itself from the ever-turning wheel of karma. That's all Manly Hall there. It's all rather simple. The process of spiritual salvation, of saving one's soul, in other words, really represents the act of bringing one's own wayward soul, quote, back into harmony with the divine plan. Find the law, learn the law, and obey the law. This is the simple teaching that lies behind all great philosophical traditions, and it is one that this bodhisattva embodies to perfection. We have it within ourselves to follow this simple code of life that Avalokita embodies. When we do, the bodhisattva archetype becomes activated within ourselves and begins to take over the guidance of the lower psychic mechanism. The heart doctrine is the body of teachings in the Mahayana system designed for the philosopher and mystic to use in order to awaken and enliven the Kuan Yin archetype within themselves. The heart doctrine is designed to put one's psychic factors in order and to bring mental and emotional extremes back to a middle equilibrium point. At the same time, it emphasizes the simple idealism of the bodhisattva, to serve, to awaken, to enlighten. These are ideals that one must accomplish within oneself and for oneself. No one else, not a church institution or guru, can freely bestow them upon you. While Kuan Yin possesses the power to bestow compassion and mercy and thus to save and redeem, it requires effort and a sincere faith from the believer to unlock the spiritual graces of this archetypal deity. As Manly Hall explains, this bodhisattva can only inspire the weary and sorrowful to transcend the illusion of worldliness within themselves. She can help, but she cannot save. In this way, she's like a physician. To again quote Manly Hall, a dedicated doctor knows in his heart that he cannot save the sick from their own mistakes. He cannot decree health for anyone or forgive even the smallest child for the mistakes that have brought it suffering. Thus, Kuan Yin cannot overcome the orderly processes of universal law. And the method of the heart doctrine, as the individual contemplates upon the life and works of this bodhisattva, a noble desire increases within them, and one becomes inspired, quote, naturally and without effort, to cease performing such actions as are inconsistent with the grace of spirit. When the unnatural desire to do wrong is quieted, then the soul's natural desire to do right is able to take control and express itself within the life of the person. This natural desire to do right takes form as a compassionate, merciful, and loving attitude towards one's fellow human beings. Here we come again to the essentially Christian lesson that lies at the heart of Mahayana Buddhism. Quote, no one can claim to be truly religious simply because he loves God. He must reach that degree of understanding which only God's love in him can bring out, where he has forgiven all others for their shortcomings, as he himself hopes to be forgiven. Meaning one must practice what they preach and be the force of change they wish to see in the world. The ultimate moral of Kuan Yin, or that Kuan Yin teaches us, is to, quote, regard all creatures with an infinite tenderness and a wise and loving solicitude. This is an ideal we can share and rejoice in. And through the practice of the heart doctrine, it is also one that we, both individually and collectively, have the power to awaken and release within ourselves. And that is the end of this article and this present section on faith, prayer, meditation, and the afterlife state, particularly as it is discussed and portrayed and perceived in the philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. And I hope you can see the associations between this system and other systems, particularly that of Christianity. And, ideally Christianity would have gone in a direction where these same teachings would have been embodied within it, but it didn't go that way. So we have to look to the East to know what the ideal sort of philosophic teaching is that incorporates mysticism and religious devotion, and the outer body and the inner body are connected. So we have to look for Mahayana Buddhism for inspiration and guidance on that. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this episode. So we'll be picking back up with a little bit more on Mahayana Buddhism in the next article, and then we'll be moving back over to Pythagoras for the 5th, and then we'll be discussing the world in the 6th section. So those are all coming up. Once again, my name is Alexsachon, and this is the Wisdom Tradition podcast, and thank you. God bless.